The mortar between the bricks on the east chimney was starting to crumble. Just a hairline fracture, really. Most people would not even see it from the ground, but I was not most people. I was Frank Callahan, and I had laid those bricks with my own hands 45 years ago. I ran my thumb over the rough red clay. It was cold. The kind of damp Ohio morning cold that settled into your joints and stayed there until noon. At 72, my knees complained more than they used to, but my hands were steady. They were still the hands of a master mason. I sat down on the patio chair, the one with the floral cushion Margaret had picked out the spring before she got sick. The fabric was fading now, bleached by 3 summers of sun, but I could not bring myself to replace it. From this spot on the roof, I could see the whole neighborhood waking up. Lights flickering on in kitchens, garage doors rumbling open. I knew the framing behind those garage doors. I knew which basements flooded in April and which foundations had settled poorly. I had built this house and half the others on this block back when Columbus was just starting to sprawl outward. Margaret used to say I cared more about stone than people. "You build a house to keep the world out, Frank," she would say, handing me my coffee. "But you have to let the love in." I climbed down the ladder, careful with my footing. The house was quiet, too quiet. It was a silence that had weight pressing against my eardrums. I went into the kitchen and started the routine. 2 scoops of dark roast, water just off the boil, wait 30 seconds, pour. I didn't need to look at the clock. It was 6:30 in the morning. My phone buzzed on the granite counter. The sound was loud enough to make me jump. Douglas. My thumb hovered over the screen. My son had not called in 3 months. Not since Christmas, when he and his wife stayed for 40 minutes, drank my eggnog, and left before the ham was even carved. I opened the message. "Cha con va Pamela se dentoine, ko chuin quan trung can ban. Dad, we are coming over tonight. An important matter to discuss." I stared at the words, important matter. My stomach tightened. It felt like the drop in pressure before a thunderstorm. I took a sip of black coffee, but it tasted like ash. I spent the morning checking the perimeter. I walked the property line, checking the fence posts, checking the grading. I needed to move. If I stopped moving, I would start thinking. And if I started thinking, I would start worrying. At 10:00, I sat in the living room and opened the laptop. It was Tuesday. Tuesday was video call day. The screen flickered, pixelated, and then resolved into chaos. Grandpa, look. Lily and Noah were shouting at the same time, their faces pressed so close to the camera that all I could see were blurry eyes and foreheads. They were 5 years old. Twins, and they were the only bright spots in a world that had turned increasingly gray. "Back up," I said, laughing. "Back up, you two. I cannot see you." They scrambled back onto the white sofa in Douglas' house. "We got a goldfish," Noah yelled. "His name is Batman." "That is a fine name for a fish," I said, Grandpa Lily said. She was twisting a strand of hair around her finger, a habit she got from her father. "When are you coming to see us? Mommy says you are sick." I froze. "I'm not sick." "Lily," I said, keeping my voice even, "Grandpa is strong as an ox. Who told you I was sick?" "Mommy said your brain is tired," Noah said. He was holding a plastic dinosaur, banging it against the tablet. My grip tightened on the edge of the laptop. My brain was tired. "Is that what she was telling them?" "Grandpa built a whole wall in the garden yesterday," I said. "Does that sound like a tired brain? I built this whole house before your daddy was even born. Every brick, every beam." "I want to see," Lily said. "Can we come over?" Suddenly, a hand reached into the frame. A manicured hand with red nails. Lily Noah Pamela's voice came from off-screen, sharp and clipped. "Piano lesson." "Now." "But we are talking to Grandpa," Lily whined. I said now. The camera tilted wildly as the tablet was snatched away. For a second I saw Pamela's face. Her jaw was set tight, her eyes cold and annoyed. She did not look at the camera. She did not say hello. The screen went black. I sat there in the silence of my living room. The reflection in the dark screen stared back at me. An old man in a flannel shirt sitting alone in a house built for a family that was shrinking by the day. Margaret's voice whispered in my memory. "Don't let anyone control your love, Frank. Trust is good, but don't let trust become weakness." I closed the laptop. By 6:00, I had set the table. I used the good china, the one with the gold rim that we only used for Thanksgiving. I roasted a chicken with rosemary and lemon, the way Douglas liked it when he was a boy. At 7 sharp, the doorbell rang. Douglas looked tired. That was the first thing I noticed. He had gained weight around the middle and his shoulders slumped as if he were carrying a load of wet cement. He would not meet my eyes. "Hey, Dad," he mumbled, stepping inside. Pamela breezed past him. She was wearing a sharp navy suit like she had come straight from a board meeting. She carried a bottle of wine. "Frank," she said, flashing a smile that did not reach her eyes. "You look, well, I look the same as I did 3 months ago, Pamela." She laughed a brittle sound. "We brought wine. It is a Cabernet, very expensive. I do not drink much these days," I said, but I took the bottle. We sat down. The chicken sat in the center of the table, steaming. Douglas pushed food around his plate. Pamela took small, precise bites. So Pamela said, wiping her mouth with a linen napkin, "This house. It really is too much for one person, isn't it? The maintenance alone must be a nightmare." "It keeps me busy," I said. "I was talking to some colleagues." She went on, pouring herself more wine. "There's a wonderful community down in Florida. Silver Lakes, full service, medical staff on site, golf courses. You would not have to lift a finger." I put my fork down. The metal clinked loudly against the china. "I do not play golf, Pamela, and I like lifting fingers. It is how I built this place. Douglas," she said sharply. Douglas looked up from his plate. He looked at me, then looked away, focusing on the centerpiece. "Dad," he said, his voice quiet, "we are just worried. You are 72. If something happened, if you fell—" "I'm fine, Douglas." "But for how long?" Pamela interrupted. Her voice had lost its sugary coating. "Look, Frank, we need to be realistic. You're sitting on a massive asset here, and you are letting it rot." I looked at the walls. Solid oak wainscoting, plaster I had smoothed myself. Nothing was rotting. "I'm not going to Florida," I said. "I'm going to die in this house." Pamela sighed. She reached into her leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. She slapped them onto the table right next to the roasted chicken. "We thought you might say that," she said, "but we really cannot take risks with your future, or ours." I looked at the header on the top page. Durable power of attorney. The words seemed to vibrate on the page. Power of attorney, total control, finances, real estate, medical decisions. Just sign it, Frank. Pamela said, "It is just a precaution to make things easier." I looked at Douglas, my son, the boy I had taught to hold a trowel, the boy I had carried on my shoulders. "Con," I said, using the Vietnamese word for child something I only did when I was desperate. "Do you agree with this?" Douglas stared at the tablecloth. He looked like he wanted to disappear. "Pamela just wants what is best. Dad," he whispered. I looked back at Pamela. Her eyes were hard, triumphant. She thought she had already won. She thought I was just bricks and mortar, easily demolished. I pushed the plate away. "No," I said. The silence that followed was louder than any jackhammer I had ever heard. The silence that followed my refusal was not the peaceful kind. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a job site right before a wall collapses. Pamela gathered her papers with a sharp snap of her wrist, her manicured nails clicking against the briefcase latch like hail on a tin roof. Douglas did not look at me. He followed her out the door like a dog that had been kicked, his shoulders hunched against the night air. I locked the door behind them. Then I locked the deadbolt. Then I engaged the chain. Sleep was impossible. I lay in the bed I used to share with Margaret, staring at the plaster ceiling. I knew every hairline fracture up there. I mapped them like rivers on a chart. My heart was hammering a rhythm against my ribs that had nothing to do with rest. I closed my eyes and drifted not into sleep, but into memory. It was 3 years ago. The house smelled of rubbing alcohol and the lavender soup Margaret insisted on making, even when she could barely lift the spoon. She had called me into the bedroom, her voice thin as parchment. "Frank," she had said, "I need you to do a job for me." She held out a metal box. It was an old biscuit tin, rusted at the corners, heavy for its size. "Take this to the basement, the east wall, the one you double reinforced in '82. I frowned, taking the box. Her hands were cold. "Hide it," she whispered. "Behind the third brick from the corner, 5th row up, the one with the V-shaped crack." "You remember?" I remembered. I remembered every brick I had ever laid. "What is in it, Maggie?" She gripped my hand with surprising strength. "Insurance. Frank, listen to me. You have a good heart. You think everyone is like you, but they are not. When I am gone, the wolves will come. They will smile and they will call you family, but they will eat you whole." Douglas is our son, I had argued, though my voice wavered. Douglas is weak, she said, tears gathering in her eyes, and he married a shark. Promise me, hide the box, only open it when your back is against the wall, when you have no other choice. I opened my eyes in the dark room. 3 years. The box had sat behind that brick gathering dust, a secret I had honored simply because I could not bear to undo her last request. Margaret knew. She had seen this night coming from 3 years away. Morning broke gray and flat over Columbus. I did not make coffee. My stomach was a knot of tension that caffeine would only pull tighter. At 9 o'clock, the landline rang. "Hi, Dad." Pamela's voice was syrup poured over broken glass. "I just wanted to apologize for last night," she said. "We came on too strong. We are just so worried about you." I gripped the receiver. "I'm fine, Pamela. Are you?" A pause. "Douglas says you have been forgetting things, leaving the stove on, getting lost in the neighborhood." I felt a cold flush of anger. I have never gotten lost in my life. I built this neighborhood. "See, that is what I mean," she purred. "Agitation is a symptom. Dad, listen. I have an appointment with Dr. Henderson next week. He is a specialist in geriatric cognitive decline. I think we should go together, just to be safe." I hung up. Cognitive decline. That was the angle. If she could not get me to sign the power of attorney, she would have me declared incompetent. She would strip away my agency until I was just a line item on a ledger. An hour later, a car pulled into the driveway. It was Douglas alone. He looked worse than he had the night before. His polo shirt was wrinkled and there were dark circles under his eyes. I opened the door and he stepped into the foyer, wringing his hands. "Dad," he said, "please, you have to work with us." I crossed my arms. "Work with you or surrender to your wife." "She is trying to protect the family assets, Dad. You have almost $1 million in equity here, plus the downtown lot. If you get sick, if you need long-term care, the state will take it all. Pamela knows how to structure these things. She is a CPA. She is a thief, Douglas, and you are holding the bag for her." His face crumbled. "Don't talk about her like that. She loves me. Does she?" I stepped closer to him. My son. 42 years old, and he still looked like the boy who was afraid of thunder. "Douglas, look at me. Remember what I taught you about the plumb line. If the first brick is crooked, the whole wall falls. Pamela is crooked, son. She's been crooked since the day she walked into this house." "Dad, stop. She's going to put me away, Douglas. She threatened me on the phone. Cognitive decline. Is that what you want, to put your father in a home so you can sell his house?" He backed away, hitting the door frame. I do not want that. But she says it is the only way. She says you are losing it." I stared at him. The betrayal was not a sharp knife. It was a dull ache, a bruising of the soul. "Get out," I said quietly. He fled. He actually ran to his car. I spent the afternoon pacing. My mind was racing, cataloging every interaction, every asset, every vulnerability. I needed to protect myself. I needed that box. But more than that, I needed proof. Night fell early. The shadows in the corners of the living room lengthened, turning into grasping fingers. At 7:30, headlights swept across the front window. They were back. I waited in the kitchen. I could feel the vibration of the car doors slamming. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. It was a new model one I had bought to video chat with the grandkids. I tapped the screen. Voice memos. I slid the phone into the breast pocket of my flannel shirt, the microphone facing out. The front door opened. They didn't knock this time. Pamela walked in first. She was not wearing a suit today. She wore jeans and a sweater, but her face was hard as granite. Douglas trailed behind her, refusing to look up from the floor. "Mr. Callahan," she said. She had dropped Dad. I stood my ground by the kitchen island. "Get out of my house. We are not leaving until you sign the papers, Frank." She threw a folder onto the counter. It slid across the granite and stopped inches from my hand. "I have spent all day on the phone," she said, her voice rising. "I have friends at the courthouse. I have friends at the hospital. I can have you under emergency guardianship by Friday. Do you know what that looks like? It means you lose the right to write a check. You lose the right to drive. You lose the right to decide when you go to the bathroom." I kept my hand steady. The red dot on my phone screen was recording every word. "Is that a threat, Pamela?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "It is a promise," she spat. "You are an old man, Frank. Who are they going to believe, a respected accountant or a retired bricklayer who talks to his dead wife?" I looked at Douglas. "Son, are you hearing this?" Douglas flinched. "Pam, Maybe we should shut up, Douglas, she snapped without looking at him. Sign the papers, Frank, or I swear to God you will die in a state facility smelling of bleach and urine. I needed the box, and I needed them to know I was not helpless. I'm going to the basement, I said. Pamela blinked. What, my records? I lied. I have deeds, documents. If we are going to do this, I need my files. I turned and walked toward the basement door. I moved with purpose, but my heart was thrashing against my ribs like a trapped bird. Wait, Pamela said. I opened the door. The stairs descended into the dark. I knew these stairs. I had built them from sturdy oak and sanded them smooth myself. I took the first step. Follow him, Douglas, Pamela barked. I heard her footsteps behind me, quick and aggressive. She was not waiting for Douglas. I was 3 steps down when it happened. I felt a hand on my back, not a gentle touch, a shove, a violent 2-handed thrust meant to displace weight. I pitched forward. Gravity took over. My hand grasped for the railing, but the angle was wrong. I did not hit the concrete floor. Thank God for my hoarding habits. I landed hard on a stack of rigid foam insulation sheets in a pile of cardboard boxes I had saved from the water heater replacement last winter. The impact knocked the wind out of me. My shoulder screamed in protest and my hip hit something hard, probably a tool case, but the insulation absorbed the lethal force. I rolled, gasping for air, staring up at the rectangle of light at the top of the stairs. Pamela stood there silhouetted against the kitchen light. She looked like a giant. Dad Douglas shouted from somewhere behind her, "Stay back!" Pamela yelled at him. She looked down at me, her face in shadow. "You think you can walk away from me?" she hissed. Her voice echoed in the stairwell. I groaned, trying to push myself up. My phone. Was it still recording? I felt the lump in my pocket. "You pushed me." I wheezed. "You fell," she said coldly. Poor old Frank. He fell down the stairs, confused, disoriented. Just like I said. She grabbed the door handle. "You stay down there and think about your options, Frank. When you are ready to sign, you knock. Pam, you cannot." Douglas started. I said, "Shut up," she screamed. Then she looked back down at me. "Enjoy the dark old man." The door slammed shut. The sound of the lock clicking into place was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Darkness swallowed the basement, total, absolute black. I lay on the cardboard, breathing the scent of dust and old lumber. My shoulder throbbed, my hip burned, but I was alive. I reached into my pocket with a shaking hand and pulled out the phone. The screen lit up the darkness, casting a ghostly blue glow on the joists above. Recording 0412. I hit stop. I was locked in my own basement. I was bruised. I was 72 years old, but for the first time in 3 years, I was not just an old man waiting to die. I was a man with a weapon. And somewhere in the dark, 5 rows up, 3 bricks over, was the rest of my arsenal. I rolled onto my side and forced myself to sit up. "Okay, Margaret," I whispered to the empty air. "Let us see what you left me." The blue light from my phone screen was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. It cast long, dancing shadows against the floor joists, overhead, turning the familiar skeleton of my house into something alien. I lay there on the cardboard for a long moment, listening to the silence upstairs. 67% battery. I looked at the file on the screen. New recording 4. 4 minutes and 12 seconds of my daughter-in-law threatening to let me die in a state facility. 4 minutes of my son saying nothing. I tapped the save button with a thumb that was trembling, though not from the cold. I sat up. My right hip screamed a sharp hot line of pain that shot down my leg, but the bone held. The insulation sheets had done their job. I was bruised, I was battered, and I was locked in a basement with no windows and one heavy oak door. Pamela thought she had buried me. She thought she had tossed an old tool into a drawer and locked it away until she needed to sell it. She forgot who built the drawer. I stood up using a stack of 2x4s for leverage. The basement air was cool and smelled of dry earth and sawdust, a scent that had comforted me for 40 years. I swung the phone light around the room. The beam cut through the dust motes, illuminating the workbench, the shelves of paint cans, the pegboard where my hammers hung in disciplined rows. I walked to the east wall. My limp was bad, but my memory was perfect. I ran my hand along the rough brick. The mortar here was a slightly different shade, a batch I had mixed myself on a Tuesday in 1979. 5th row up, 3rd brick from the corner. I counted 1, 2, 3. I crouched down, ignoring the protest on my knees. I ran my thumb over the face of the brick until I felt it. the V-shaped crack. To anyone else it looked like a flaw, a mason acting careless with his trowel. To me, it was a signature. I set the phone on a shelf, aiming the light at the wall. I dug my fingers into the mortar joints. I had used a high lime mixture for this specific spot, softer than the Portland cement holding the rest of the house together. It crumbled under my fingernails. The brick shifted. With a grunt of effort, I worked it loose, sliding the heavy red clay rectangle out of its niche. I set it on the floor. The hole in the wall was dark and breathed a scent of stale air. I reached in. My fingers brushed against cold metal. I pulled it out. It was an old biscuit tin, the kind Margaret used to keep her sewing supplies in. The painted flowers on the lid were faded, scratched by the rough brick, but the metal was solid. I carried it to the workbench and sat on the stool. My hands were covered in red dust. I wiped them on my flannel shirt before prying the lid open. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, lay the things my wife had hidden from the world. There was a thick envelope with the logo of a law firm embossed in the corner. There was a business card. There was a black USB drive. And there was a small, heavy LED flashlight. Margaret. She knew the power might be out. She knew I might be in the dark. I picked up the flashlight and clicked it on. The beam was bright and steady, far better than my dying phone. I set the phone aside and picked up the envelope. A letter was clipped to the front. The handwriting was unmistakable, looping elegant with sharp crosses on the T's, my dearest Frank. I had to stop. I had to close my eyes and breathe through the tightness in my throat. It felt like she was standing right behind me, her hand on my shoulder. I opened my eyes and read. If you are reading this letter in the basement, it means the thing I feared most has happened. It means my time has run out and the wolves have come to the door. I saw the way Pamela looked at this house at our anniversary party. She did not see a home, Frank. She saw a number on a balance sheet. And I know Douglas. I love our son, but he has a spine made of water. That is not your fault. And it is not mine. It is just who he is. 7 years ago in 2017, I made a decision. I took 60% ownership of this house and the entire deed to the downtown commercial lot, and I placed them into an irrevocable trust. I reread the sentence. Irrevocable trust. The beneficiaries are Lily and Noah, not Douglas, not Pamela, just the children. This trust cannot be changed. It cannot be contested. It does not belong to anyone but the twins. Evelyn Monroe is the trustee. You remember Evelyn? My friend from university, she has the originals. The USB drive in this box contains recordings. I know, Frank. You always said eavesdropping was rude. But when I was sick, Pamela sat by my bed and talked to people on the phone. She thought I was asleep. She thought I was too far gone to understand. She told me her plans to my face, thinking I was just a senile old woman. I recorded our conversations. Since I was in the room and part of the interaction, Ohio law says I can record them. They are legal. They are proof. Use them. You built this house with your hands. I am protecting it with my mind. Do not grieve for the son we lost, Frank. Grieve for what he chose to throw away. I love you. Now get up. You have work to do. Love always, Margaret. A tear landed on the paper, blooming into a dark circle over her signature. She had known. For 3 years she had carried this secret, watching Pamela smile across the dinner table, watching Douglas fade into his wife's shadow. She had fought a war I did not even know was happening. I folded the letter and placed it carefully back in the tin. I pocketed the USB drive. I put the business card in my wallet. Evelyn Monroe, estate planning and elder law. I stood up. The pain in my hip was a dull throb now easily ignored. I had work to do. I looked at the heavy oak door at the top of the stairs. Pamela had locked it from the outside, likely with the heavy padlock hasp I had installed years ago to keep the grandkids from wandering down here. I checked my watch. 5:30 in the morning. Dawn would be breaking soon. I walked over to the dusty corner behind the furnace. There was a red toolbox there, smaller than the others, covered in a layer of grime. I blew the dust off the lid. Inside lay a set of tension wrenches and picks. I had not touched these in 50 years. Before I laid bricks, I had apprenticed for a summer with Lou Bergman, a locksmith who operated out of a van on the west side. Lou had hands that shook from too much coffee and too many cigarettes, but the moment he touched a lock, they turned into stone. A lock is just a puzzle, Frankie used to tell me. It is just metal pins arguing with a spring. You just have to win the argument. I picked up a tension wrench and a hook pick. The metal felt cold and familiar. I climbed the stairs. At the top, I knelt by the door. I shone the flashlight into the keyhole. It was a standard 5-pin tumbler lock. Not high security. I had bought it at the hardware store down the street in 1985. I inserted the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway and applied a feather-light pressure. I slid the pick in. Pin 1, spring, nothing there. Pin 2, a slight click, binding. I focused everything on my fingertips. I shut out the pain in my shoulder. I shut out the memory of my son turning his back on me. I became nothing but tactile sensation. Pin 3, click, I felt the plug rotate a fraction of a degree. Pin 4 was stubborn. It felt gritty. I eased off the tension, let it reset, and tried again. Gentle, Lou voice rasped in my ear. Don't fight it, kid. Ask nicely. Click, pin 5. The plug turned. I heard the heavy thunk of the deadbolt retracting. I pulled the tools out and put my hand on the brass knob. I turned it. The door swung open. The kitchen was gray with early morning light. The air smelled of stale coffee and the expensive perfume Pamela had worn the night before. The house was silent. They were gone. They had left me in the dark to rot, confident that the lock would hold, confident that the old man was finished. I stepped out of the basement and into my kitchen. I walked to the window. The sun was just cresting over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. It hit the roof of the garage, illuminating the shingles I had nailed down myself. I reached into my pocket and touched the cold metal of the USB drive. Then I touched the phone in my breast pocket. I walked to the counter, picked up the landline receiver, and dialed the number on the business card. It was barely 6 in the morning, but I had a feeling Evelyn Monroe would be awake. Margaret had told her I would call. I waited for the ring, standing in the center of the house I built, ready to tear their world apart brick by brick. The phone rang 3 times before a woman picked up. Her voice was crisp, professional, but carrying a warmth that stopped me short. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "I have been expecting this call for 3 years." 40 minutes later, I parked my truck in a garage on High Street. Downtown Columbus was waking up, the morning traffic clogging the arteries of the city, but I moved through it with a singular focus. My hip ached with every step on the concrete, a dull, rhythmic reminder of the night before, but I did not limp. I refused to limp. Evelyn Monroe's office was located in one of the older buildings near the State House, the kind with marble floors and brass elevator doors that shined like gold. It was a building made to last, just like the woman waiting for me on the 6th floor. Evelyn was 58, with silver hair cut in a sharp bob and eyes that missed nothing. She did not offer me coffee or small talk. She shook my hand with a grip that could crush walnuts, looked at the bruise blooming on my jawline, and simply nodded. "Come in, Frank," she said. "We have a lot of work to do." Her office smelled of old paper and lemon polish. I sat in a leather chair that groaned under my weight, placing the rusted biscuit tin on her mahogany desk. It looked out of place against the polished wood, a piece of rough reality invading a sanctuary of law. Evelyn opened the tin. She handled the documents with reverence. "Margaret was the smartest woman I ever knew," Evelyn said softly. She looked at the date on the trust document. 2017, 7 years ago, 4 years before she passed. She looked up at me. "Do you know what this is?" "Frank, Margaret said it was a trust," I said. "For the grandkids. It is an irrevocable trust." Evelyn corrected, leaning forward. "That is the key word. Irrevocable. Once Margaret signed these papers, the assets moved out of her name and into the trust. She transferred 60% ownership of your house and 100% of the downtown commercial lot into this entity." She tapped the paper. "The beneficiaries are Lily and Noah Callahan. I am the trustee until they turn 25. I frowned, trying to follow the mortar lines of the law. "What does that mean for Pamela?" Evelyn smiled, and it was a dangerous thing to witness. "It means that even if Pamela got guardianship over you today, even if she declared you incompetent tomorrow, she cannot touch these assets. They do not belong to you. They do not belong to Douglas. They belong to the twins. And because this was done 7 years ago, it is well beyond the look-back period for Medicaid or any clawback attempts. It is ironclad." I sat back the air, leaving my lungs in a rush. 60%. That meant I still owned 40%, enough to live there, enough to have rights. But the bulk of the wealth the honeypot Pamela was buzzing around was already gone. "She wasted 6 years planning a heist on an empty vault," I said. Evelyn nodded. "Precisely." She reached for the black USB drive I had placed on the desk. "Now," she said, her voice dropping an octave, "let us hear what she had to say." She plugged the drive into her laptop. The silence in the room was heavy as we waited for the computer to recognize the device. "I need to explain something first," Evelyn said, her hand hovering over the mouse. "Ohio is a one-party consent state regarding recording laws. That means as long as one person in the conversation knows it is being recorded, it is legal. Margaret recorded these herself. She was a participant. That makes them admissible evidence. Play it," I said. The voice that filled the room made my heart stop. It was Margaret. Not the strong woman I had married, but the frail, breathless version from the end. "Pamela, honey." Margaret's voice wavered. "What will happen to the house when I'm gone?" Then Pamela's voice, clear, confident, dismissive. "Don't worry about it, Mom. We will handle it. Dad is going to need care. We will probably sell the place. It is too big for him anyway. The equity will cover expenses." "And the land downtown?" Margaret asked. "Sold," Pamela said. "Douglas and I have looked into it. It is prime real estate. We can get nearly $2 million for the whole package. Dad will be comfortable. There are nice facilities." The recording clicked off. "Facilities," I whispered. She was planning to warehouse me before Margaret was even cold. "There is another one," Evelyn said. She clicked a second file. This one was even worse. It was Pamela speaking to someone I did not recognize, but the context was clear. She was talking to Margaret, thinking my wife was asleep or too medicated to understand. But Margaret must have been awake, the recorder running under her pillow. "Doctor says he can write the report," Pamela was saying. "Cognitive decline is easy to fake on paper if you know which boxes to tick. We just need to wait a few months after the funeral. Let him grieve. Then we file for guardianship." My hands curled into fists on my knees. My knuckles turned white. She played the long game, I said. She underestimated her opponent. Evelyn replied. She closed the laptop. "These recordings prove premeditated intent to defraud. They prove undue influence. And they prove she has been plotting against your agency for years." I reached into my flannel pocket. "I have one more," I said. I pulled out my phone. "Last night," I said before she pushed me down the stairs. Evelyn's eyes widened. "She pushed you?" I nodded. I hit play. The sound of the basement door slamming echoed tinny and sharp from the phone speaker. Then Pamela, voices muffled but unmistakable. "You will sign, or you will be here until you die." "I don't care." Evelyn listened to the whole 4 minutes. When it finished, she took off her glasses and cleaned them slowly. "That," she said quietly, "is false imprisonment. It is a felony, and because you recorded it while you were being threatened, you were the consenting party. It is legal." She looked at me, her face hard. "We have her, Frank. We have her on fraud. We have her on abuse. We have her in imprisonment. And we have the trust documents that cut the legs out from under her financial motivation. What do we do?" I asked. Evelyn pulled a yellow legal pad toward her. She uncapped a pen. "We go on the offensive. Step 1, we file a police report for the false imprisonment. Today, right now. Step 2, we call Adult Protective Services and file a report for attempted financial exploitation. I will attach transcripts of these recordings. Step 3, you see Dr. Cole." "Raymond?" I asked. "He has been my doctor for 20 years. "Exactly," Evelyn said. "We get a fresh competency evaluation. Today. A clean bill of mental health from a doctor who has known you for decades will crush any petition she tries to file for guardianship." She stopped writing and looked at me. "Step 4, she said. "We tell them. Tonight," I said. "I told Douglas to come back tonight." Evelyn hesitated. Her pen hovered over the paper. "Frank," she said gently. "Douglas." I looked out the window at the gray stone of the State House. I knew what she was going to ask. "He was there, Evelyn?" I said. "He heard her threaten me. He saw her push me. And he walked away." "He has to choose," Evelyn said. "That is the hard part. We can protect the money. We can protect you. But we cannot protect Douglas from the consequences of his own cowardice. If he stands with her after seeing all this, he goes down with her." Margaret wrote something in her letter. I said, my voice thick. "She said I should not grieve for him. She said I should grieve for what he chose to lose." Evelyn nodded. Margaret was right. She tore the sheet off the legal pad and handed it to me. "Get the police report filed, Frank. Go see Dr. Cole. I will handle the APS filing from here. And tonight," she pulled her laptop into her bag. "Tonight, I will be there on speakerphone. You are not fighting this alone anymore." I drove home with the window down, letting the cold air numb the heat in my face. I stopped at the precinct and spent an hour with a detective who looked at the bruising on my shoulder and listened to the recording with a grim expression. I stopped at Dr. Cole's office where Raymond shone a light in my eyes, asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens, and signed a notarized letter stating I was as sharp as a tack. By the time I pulled into my driveway, it was late afternoon. The house looked different. For 3 years it had felt like a tomb. Now it looked like what it was, a fortress. I had laid the foundation. I had raised the walls. It was strong, and so was I. I went inside and made coffee. I didn't clean up the dust from the basement. I didn't fix the lock on the door. I left the evidence exactly where it was. At 5:30, the sound of a key in the lock made me look up. Douglas. He stepped into the kitchen, his eyes darting around nervously. He expected silence. He expected a locked basement door and a broken old man begging to be let out. Instead, he found me sitting at the kitchen island, a mug of coffee in my hand, watching him. "Dad?" His voice cracked. He looked at the basement door standing open. He looked at me, cleaned up, wearing a fresh shirt, looking steady. "Dad, how did you—" I set the mug down. The ceramic clink sounded like a gavel hitting a bench. "I built this house, Douglas," I said. My voice was low, steady, the rumble of a heavy engine. "Did you really think a $5 padlock could keep me out of my own home?" He went pale. He took a step back, his hand fumbling for the doorframe. Pamela said, "We were coming back, tonight. We were going to let you out. Were you?" I asked. "Or were you going to wait until I was thirsty enough to sign your papers?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. "Go home, Douglas," I said. He blinked, confused. "What?" "Go get your wife. Bring her here. 7:00, Dad." I don't think I stood up. I did not shout. I did not have to. I just stood to my full height, the height of a man who had spent 50 years hauling stone and building things that lasted. 7:00, Douglas. We are going to have a family meeting, and you are going to learn exactly who your mother was, and exactly who your wife is. He stared at me for a long second, fear warring with confusion in his eyes. Then he turned and fled. I watched him go. I finished my coffee. Then I went to the living room and set up the laptop on the coffee table. I placed the rusted biscuit tin next to it. I sat down in Margaret's chair and waited for the wolves to come. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times. The sound resonated through the house, deep and rhythmic, counting down seconds I would never get back. I sat in the living room, Margaret's rusted biscuit tin on the coffee table next to my open laptop. On the screen, Evelyn Monroe was a silent, watchful presence via video call. Her face composed her background, a wall of leather-bound legal volumes. Headlights swept across the front window, cutting through the drawn curtains. A car door slammed, then another. I did not get up to unlock the door. I stayed seated in the wingback chair, my hands folded in my lap, waiting. The front door opened. They did not knock. Pamela walked in first, and the air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. She was dressed for a boardroom execution, wearing a charcoal blazer and heels that clicked sharply on the hardwood I had laid 30 years ago. Douglas trailed behind her, his eyes red-rimmed, looking like a man marching to the gallows. Pamela stopped in the center of the rug. She looked at me, then at the open basement door in the kitchen hallway, then back to me. Her expression was not one of fear. It was annoying. She looked at me the way a manager looks at an employee who is clocked in late. "Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice tight, "I see you managed to get out. That is impressive for a man of your condition." I said nothing. I just watched her. We were coming back. "Frank," she continued, smoothing the front of her jacket, "we were not going to leave you there. We just needed you to understand the gravity of the situation, to understand that we are trying to help you." She took a step closer, her eyes landing on the papers scattered on the coffee table. "But since you were being difficult," she said, reaching into her bag, "I brought the papers again. We can do this the easy way, or we can—" "Sit down." "Pamela," I said. My voice was not loud. It was the voice I used when a heavy load was swinging from a crane, low and imperative. She blinked, surprised by the tone. She opened her mouth to argue, then her eyes flicked to the laptop screen. She saw Evelyn. "Who is that?" she asked, pointing a manicured finger. "That is Evelyn Monroe," I said. "My attorney." Pamela let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You got a lawyer? In 12 hours, Frank. You do not even know how to use the internet properly. Who is she? Some legal aid volunteer?" "Hello, Ms. Whitfield." Evelyn's voice cut through the room, amplified by the Bluetooth speaker I had set up. "I am an estate planning attorney with 30 years of experience in elder law, and I strongly suggest you take a seat." Pamela's smile faltered just for a second. She looked at Douglas, but he was staring at his shoes. She tightened her jaw, pulled out a dining chair and sat on the edge of it, her back rigid. "Fine," she said. "Let us play your game. Having a lawyer present does not change the facts. Frank is incompetent. He is a danger to himself. We are petitioning for emergency guardianship tomorrow morning." "No," Evelyn said calmly. "You are not." Pamela rolled her eyes. "And on what grounds will you stop us? On the grounds that there is nothing for you to take," Evelyn replied. I reached forward and picked up the thick stack of documents from the biscuit tin. The paper was heavy, high-quality bond, the kind that whispered when you turned the pages. I slid the stack across the coffee table. It stopped inches from Pamela's hand. "Do you know what that is?" I asked. She looked down, reading the cover page, her brow furrowed. "The Callahan Family Irrevocable Trust," she read, dated October 14th, 2017. She looked up, confused. "What is this?" "It is the reason you have wasted the last 6 years of your life," I said. Evelyn took over, her voice precise and surgical. 7 years ago, Margaret Callahan transferred 60% of the ownership of the house at 42 Oak Street and 100% of the deed to the downtown commercial lot into that trust. Pamela flipped the page, her eyes scanning rapidly. Her face remained impassive, but her fingers were gripping the paper so hard the edges crinkled. So she said, "It is a trust. We can dissolve it. As Douglas's wife, you can do nothing." Evelyn interrupted. "The key word is irrevocable. It means it cannot be changed, amended, or canceled. It means the assets in that trust do not belong to Frank. They do not belong to Douglas, and they certainly do not belong to you." Pamela froze. "The beneficiaries are Lily and Noah Callahan." Evelyn continued, "I am the sole trustee until they reach the age of 25. The assets are locked. They are untouchable. They are completely shielded from probate, from Medicaid lookbacks, and from any guardianship proceedings you might try to file." Pamela dropped the papers. They fanned out across the table. "That is impossible," she whispered. The color was draining from her face, leaving her makeup standing out in stark relief. "Douglas is the sole heir. By law, he is entitled to nothing," I said. "Margaret knew Pamela. She knew what you were. She moved the assets 4 years before she died." Douglas made a sound, a low whimper in the back of his throat. He looked at his wife. "Pam," he said, you said we would have the money for the business. You said the land downtown was worth $2 million. It is worth $2 million, I said, and every cent of it will go to my grandchildren's college funds, not to your debts, Douglas, and not to her lifestyle." Pamela stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. "This is a forgery," she spat. She was shaking now, the mask of control shattering. "Margaret was a housewife. She didn't know how to do this. You tricked her, or you forged this after she died. I will contest this. I will drag you through court until you are bankrupt." I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the fear behind the rage. She was not mad about the money. She was mad that she had been outsmarted by a woman she thought was weak and a man she thought was stupid. "You will not contest anything," Evelyn said, "because if you do, we will play these recordings for the judge." I clicked the mouse on my laptop. The first audio file opened. The sound of a hospital monitor beeping rhythmically filled the living room. Then Margaret's voice, weak, breathless, but undeniably her. "Pamela, honey, what will happen to the house when I am gone?" Then Pamela's voice, dismissive, arrogant. "Don't worry about it, Mom. We will handle it. Dad is going to need care. We will probably sell the place. It is too big for him anyway. The equity will cover expenses." Pamela's hand flew to her mouth. She stared at the computer speaker as if it were a snake. "And the land downtown?" Margaret asked. "Sold," Pamela's voice said. "Douglas and I have looked into it. It is prime real estate. We can get nearly $2 million for the whole package. Dad will be comfortable. There are nice facilities." I stopped the playback. The silence in the room was absolute. Douglas was staring at his wife, his mouth slightly open, horror dawning in his eyes. "You told her that," he whispered. "While she was dying, you told her you were going to sell her home." Pamela turned to him, her eyes wide. "Douglas, I was placating her. She was confused." I clicked the second file. This was Pamela on the phone talking to someone else. "Doctor says he can write the report. Cognitive decline is easy to fake on paper if you know which boxes to tick. We just need to wait a few months after the funeral. Let him grieve. Then we file for guardianship." Pamela backed away until her legs hit the edge of the sofa. She sat down hard. "She recorded me," she breathed. That is illegal. She can't do that. Ohio is a one-party consent state. Evelyn said, her voice like a whip. Margaret was a participant in the first conversation. She was in the room for the second. It is entirely legal and entirely admissible. I have one more, I said. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I didn't need the laptop for this one. I held it up. Last night, I said in the kitchen, I hit play. You will sign or you will be here until you die. I don't care. I just need your signature. The threat hung in the air, naked and brutal. That is a felony, Pamela Evelyn said. False imprisonment, elder abuse, attempted extortion. We filed the police report this afternoon. The detective was very interested in the audio. Pamela looked at me. For the first time in 6 years, there was no condescension in her eyes. There was only terror. She looked at the papers on the table, then at the computer screen, then at the phone in my hand. The walls she had built around herself, the career, the reputation, the control were crumbling into dust. She stood up. Her legs were unsteady. I have to go, she stammered. She did not grab the papers. She did not look at Douglas. She turned and walked toward the door. Her movements jerky and uncoordinated. Douglas sat there. He looked at the empty doorway where his wife had just been. Then he looked at me. Dad, he said. His voice was broken, a child's voice in a man's body. She said it was for us. She said you were sick. She promised. I looked at my son. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to shake him. I wanted to ask him how he could have been so blind, so weak, so willing to trade his father for a quiet life. But looking at him now, slumped in that chair, I only felt a vast, hollowing sadness. She used you, Douglas, I said quietly. She used you to get the money, and when the money was gone, she would have discarded you too. He put his head in his hands. I didn't know, he sobbed. I swear, Dad, I didn't know she would go this far. You were there last night, I said. You saw her push me. You heard her lock the door. You knew. You just didn't want to believe it because believing it meant you had to do something. He flinched as if I had struck him. He stood up slowly. He looked like an old man himself. I have to talk to her, he said. I stared at him. After everything he had just heard, after the fraud, the cruelty, the threats, he was still going after her. The habit of obedience was too deep, the fear of being alone too strong. You can stay here, Douglas, I said. There is a guest room. You do not have to go with her. He paused at the door. He looked back at me, tears streaming down his face, but he shook his head. She is my wife, Dad. He walked out. The front door closed with a soft click. I sat there in silence. The grandfather clock chimed the half hour. On the screen, Evelyn watched me with sympathetic eyes. He made his choice, Frank, she said softly. I looked at the trust documents spread across the table. I looked at the biscuit tin. I had won. The assets were safe. Pamela was exposed. My home was secure. But the house felt empty, emptier than it had ever been. I walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. I watched the taillights of Douglas's car disappear down the street, fading into the dark like dying embers. I had saved the inheritance, but I had lost my son. The silence in the house was not peaceful. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a structure that had just survived an earthquake but was waiting for the aftershocks. I sat in the wingback chair long after the taillights of Douglas's car had vanished. The coffee on the table had gone cold, a dark, stagnant pool in the ceramic mug. I had won. The trust was secure. The police report was filed. Pamela's scheme to warehouse me in a state facility had been exposed and dismantled in less than an hour. By every metric of logic and law, I was the victor. So why did I feel like I was sitting in a pile of rubble? At 11:42, the phone rang. The sound was jarring, a shrill mechanical scream in the quiet house. I stared at the receiver on the side table. It was late, too late for good news. I picked it up. Hello, Dad. The word was sharp, stripped of any warmth. It was Douglas, but it did not sound like the son who had sat in my kitchen 3 hours ago weeping. It sounded like a stranger. Douglas. I sat up straighter, my joints popping. Where are you? I'm at a Motel 6 off the interstate, he said. His voice was brittle, vibrating with a frequency I had never heard before. Are you happy, Dad? Do you feel good about yourself? I rubbed my eyes with my free hand. Douglas, I did not want this. I wanted to protect you. She was going to. Stop, he shouted. The distortion cracked the speaker. Just stop. You think you saved me? You destroyed my life. I gripped the phone tighter. Son, she was stealing from us. She was going to put me away, and you humiliated her. Douglas cut in. You sat there with your lawyer and your recordings, and you stripped her bare. You pushed her into a corner. And do you know what happens when you push Pamela into a corner? I heard the sound of a car passing in the background on his end. He was outside, probably pacing the parking lot. She is filing for divorce, Dad, he said, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. She is sitting in the room right now on the phone with a lawyer. She says the marriage is irretrievably broken. She says I conspired with an abusive family member to gaslight her. She is lying, Douglas. You know she is lying. It does not matter, he screamed. Don't you get it? The truth does not matter. She is leaving. She is taking everything she can, and she is going for full custody. My heart hammered against my ribs. Full custody. She cannot do that, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The courts listen to mothers, Dad, especially when the father is emotionally unstable and has no money because his wife controlled all the accounts. She is painting a picture, Dad, and you gave her the canvas. Douglas, come home. We can fight this. Evelyn says, I do not want your help, he spat. I do not want your money. I do not want your house. There was a pause. A heavy breathing silence. You want to protect Lily and Noah? He said softly. Well, congratulations. You protected their inheritance, but you will never see them again. The blood drained from my face. Douglas. I mean it, he said. As long as I have any say, as long as Pamela has any say, you are done. You are a toxic influence. That is what the court filing will say. You are cut off. No more video calls. No more visits. You want to live in that fortress of yours. Fine. You live in it alone. Click. The dial tone hummed in my ear, a flat, indifferent note. I slowly placed the receiver back on the cradle. My hand was shaking. I looked at my own fingers as if they belonged to someone else. They were rough, calloused hands, hands that could break a brick in half with a well-placed tap, but they felt useless now. I stood up and walked to the kitchen. I turned off the lights, plunging the house into darkness. I did not go upstairs. I could not face the empty bedroom, the bed that was too big for one person. Instead, I walked back to the living room and sat in the dark. Moonlight filtered through the sheer curtains, casting long, pale rectangles on the floor. I looked around the room. I had built the mantel over the fireplace from reclaimed cherry wood. I had laid the crown molding. I had sanded these floors on my hands and knees until they were smooth as glass. Every corner of this house was a testament to my skill, a testament to my ability to build things that lasted, and yet my family had crumbled. I reached for my wallet on the side table. I opened it and pulled out the small laminated photograph I kept behind my driver's license. It was taken 5 years ago at the twins' christening. Before the cancer took Margaret, before the greed took Pamela, before the fear took Douglas. In the photo, Douglas was smiling. He had his arm around me. He looked proud. Don't grieve for the son we lost, Margaret's letter had said. Grieve for what he chose to throw away. I traced his face in the dim light. Margaret was stronger than me. She saw the rot in the timber long before I did. I had spent my life believing that if you built the foundation strong enough, the house would stand. I believed that if I was right, if I had the truth, that would be enough. I was right. I had the truth. I had the law on my side. And I had lost my son. I had lost my grandchildren. I leaned my head back against the chair. A single tear leaked out, hot and stinging, rolling into the deep lines of my face. I sat there until the moon set and the gray light of dawn began to wash out the shadows. Morning brought no relief, only a headache that sat behind my eyes like a lead weight. I didn't make coffee. I didn't check the perimeter of the house. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the grain of the wood, waiting for I did not know what. At 9 o'clock the phone rang again. I stared at it. A part of me hoped it was Douglas calling to say he didn't mean it. A part of me feared it was the police telling me something terrible had happened at a Motel 6. I picked it up. Hello, Mr. Frank Callahan. It was a woman's voice. Not Evelyn, not Pamela. It was professional, detached, and weary. Speaking. Mr. Callahan, this is Jennifer Walsh. I am an investigator with Franklin County Adult Protective Services. My grip on the phone tightened. Evelyn said she was going to file a report. She moved fast. Yes, Ms. Walsh. My attorney, Evelyn Monroe, said she would be contacting you regarding have Ms. Monroe's report. Ms. Walsh interrupted. We received it this morning regarding the attempted financial exploitation. However, that is not the only reason I'm calling. I frowned. What do you mean? We received a cross-complaint early this morning, Mr. Callahan, from Mrs. Pamela Callahan. The room seemed to tilt. A complaint, I asked. Against me. Yes, Mrs. Callahan alleges that she has been the victim of emotional abuse, intimidation, and domestic harassment at your hands. She claims you have been weaponizing your medical condition to control family members, and that yesterday evening you lured her to your home to publicly humiliate her and threaten her. I stood up the chair, scraping loudly against the floor. That is a lie, I said, my voice rising. She locked me in my basement. She tried to force me to sign a power of attorney. I have recordings. We have the recordings your attorney sent, Ms. Walsh said calmly, and we are reviewing them. But Mrs. Callahan claims those recordings are taken out of context and were obtained through entrapment. She also alleges that you have isolated her husband, Mr. Douglas Callahan, from her. Entrapment, isolated, Douglas. She is spinning a narrative, Frank. The thought hit me with the force of a sledgehammer. She is using the system against me. Darvo. Deny attack, reverse, victim and offender, Ms. Walsh. I said, forcing my voice to slow down. Listen to me. This woman is a fraud. She is trying to steal my home, Mr. Callahan, please understand my position. I'm not a judge. I'm an investigator. When we receive cross-complaints involving vulnerable adults and allegations of abuse, we are required to open a full investigation into both parties. What does that mean? I asked. The dread in my stomach was turning into nausea. It means I will be coming out to interview you. I will also be interviewing Mr. and Mrs. Callahan, and until our preliminary assessment is complete, she paused. The silence on the line was deafening. Until the assessment is complete, we are recommending a temporary no-contact order between you and the minor children, Lily and Noah Callahan. Given the volatile nature of the allegations and the presence of potential domestic instability, it is standard procedure to restrict access to protect the minors from further conflict. No, I whispered. You cannot do that. It is a recommendation, Mr. Callahan, but if it is violated, we can seek a court order. We want to ensure the children are not used as pawns in this dispute. They are my life, I said. Then please cooperate with the investigation. I will be in touch to schedule a home visit. The line went dead. I stood in the middle of my kitchen, the receiver dangling from my hand. The sunlight streaming through the window felt cold, mocking. I looked at the basement door. It was open. I was free. I had the deed to the house. I had the trust. But Pamela had found the one crack in my foundation I had not reinforced. She had found the one thing I could not lock in a box. She had taken the future. I dropped the phone. It clattered against the tile, the sound echoing through the empty house like a gunshot. I sank to the floor, my back against the cabinets, and for the first time in 45 years, I felt the walls of my home closing in on me. I was safe. I was vindicated, and I was completely, utterly alone. 3 days passed in a blur of gray light and silence. I did not leave the property. I did not answer the phone when the telemarketers called. I moved through the house like a ghost touching the walls I had built, feeling the cold plaster against my fingertips. I had won the war, but the battlefield was empty. On the third night, I sat in the backyard on the floral chair Margaret had loved. The air was crisp, biting with the promise of autumn frost. The neighbors' houses were lit up squares of yellow warmth against the dark filled with noise and dinner plates and arguments about homework. Normal life. My house was dark. I looked at the brickwork of the chimney barely visible in the moonlight. I had pointed that mortar 45 years ago. I had thought that if I built the walls thick enough, if I used the best materials, nothing could get in to hurt us. I was wrong. The rot had started from the inside. I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out the folded piece of paper. The edges were soft now, worn from how many times my rough thumbs had traced them. Margaret's letter. I clicked on the small flashlight she had left in the tin. The beam was weak, the battery fading, but it was enough to illuminate her handwriting. Don't grieve for the son we lost, Frank. Grieve for what he chose to throw away. I had read those words a dozen times, but I had read them as an accusation. I had read them as Margaret telling me that Douglas was gone, that he was broken beyond repair. But tonight, in the cold silence of the yard, I read them differently. Margaret was not cruel. She never had been. She was pragmatic. She was telling me that I could not save someone who did not want to be saved. For 3 years, I had carried the weight of Douglas's weakness on my shoulders. I had tried to be strong enough for both of us. I had tried to be the spine he lacked. It was exhausting, and it was futile. You cannot shore up a wall that wants to collapse, Frank. You just get crushed when it finally comes down. I lowered the paper. The wind rustled the dry leaves of the oak tree I had planted when Douglas was born. I want you to save yourself, she was saying. I sat there for a long time, letting the cold seep into my bones until it wasn't painful anymore, just a part of me. I let go of the anger. I let go of the need to be right. I let go of the need to fix my son, and in that space something else took root. I looked at the upstairs window where the nursery used to be, where Lily and Noah would stay when they visited. I did not need to fix Douglas, but I did need to be there for them. The sun came up slowly, burning the mist off the grass. I went inside my joint stiff and made coffee. I drank it standing up at the kitchen counter. Then I picked up the phone. It was 7 a.m. Evelyn Monroe picked up on the second ring. "Frank," she asked. Her voice was alert. "Is everything all right? I want to file a petition, Evelyn." There was a pause. A petition for what Ohio Revised Code. I said the words feeling heavy and solid in my mouth. Grandparent visitation rights. I could hear the smile in her voice when she answered. Section 3109.051, she recited. If the parents are unmarried or, and this is the key part, if there is a pending divorce or separation, the court can grant reasonable companionship or visitation rights to a grandparent if it is in the best interest of the child. There is a divorce pending, I said. Douglas told me on the phone. Then we stood. Evelyn said, "We have to prove you have an established relationship with Lily and Noah. We have to prove that cutting them off from you would cause them harm." "I have phone logs," I said. "I have photos. I have 5 years of history. I built a playground in the backyard." "That is excellent," Evelyn said. "Listen to me, Frank. This shifts the battlefield. We are not fighting Pamela on her terms anymore. We aren't fighting about money or abuse allegations. We are fighting for the children's welfare. Courts like that. Judges like stability. And right now, you are the most stable thing in those children's lives. Do it," I said. "File it today." "I will," she said. "Frank." "Yes. You sound different." I looked out the window at the morning sun hitting the garage roof. "I'm just done waiting for the roof to cave in, Evelyn. I'm building a scaffold." I hung up. I spent the morning cleaning. I swept the dust from the basement stairs. I oiled the hinges of the back door. I washed the dishes that had piled up in the sink. I was restoring order. If the state investigator came, she would not find a lonely, chaotic old man. She would find Frank Callahan, master mason, living in a house that was squared and leveled. At 2 p.m, the phone rang again. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and stared at it. It could be Evelyn. It could be the investigator, Ms. Walsh. I picked it up. "Callahan residence. Dad." The voice was unrecognizable at first. It was thick, choked with mucus and exhaustion. It sounded like a man who had been dragged behind a truck for 10 miles. "Douglas." There was a ragged intake of breath on the other end. "She locked me out, Dad." I gripped the edge of the counter. "But I went to the bank this morning," he stammered, "to get cash for the motel. The card was declined. I called the bank. She moved everything. Joint savings, checking, even the emergency fund. She transferred it all to a new account in her name, only at a different bank." "That is illegal, Douglas," I said automatically. "Marital assets are frozen when she did it before she filed." He sobbed. "She timed it, Dad. She planned it, just like she planned the house, just like she planned the guardianship." I closed my eyes. Of course she did. Pamela did not leave loose ends. I drove to the house, he continued, his voice rising in panic. "My key did not work. She changed the locks, Dad, in one day. My clothes, my laptop, my work files, they are all inside. I pounded on the door. She called the police. She called the police on you. She told them I was erratic, that I was threatening her. The officers, they told me to leave. They said it was a civil matter, but if I came back, they would arrest me for trespassing. In my own house, Dad." He broke down then. It was a guttural, ugly sound, the sound of a man realizing that the ground he stood on was actually a trap door. "I am at the motel," he choked out, "but I cannot pay for tonight. They are going to kick me out at checkout. I have $11 in my pocket. I don't know what to do." I listened to him weep. 3 days ago, he screamed at me. He had told me I was toxic. He had told me I would never see my grandchildren again. He had stood by while his wife pushed me down a flight of stairs and then blamed me for falling. Justice would be hanging up the phone. Justice would be letting him sleep in his car and learn the hard way what it felt like to be powerless. That was what the Old Testament demanded. An eye for an eye, a lockout for a lockout. But I looked at the basement door. It was standing open. Margaret's voice whispered in my ear, "Don't grieve for what he chose to lose. He had lost his marriage. He had lost his dignity. He had lost his money. But he was still my son. And a house divided against itself could not stand. If I wanted to save Lily and Noah, I needed Douglas. Not as a warrior, he would never be that, but as a witness." "Douglas," I said. He stopped crying, sniffing loudly. "Get in your car," I said. "Dad, I can't ask you." "I didn't ask. I said, get in your car. Come here." Silence stretched across the line. After everything I said, he whispered. After what I let her do, I looked at the kitchen table, the empty chair where he used to do his homework. "You were wrong, Douglas. You were weak. And you have a hell of a lot of work to do to fix it. But you are a Callahan. And Callahans do not sleep in parking lots while there is a roof over this family's head." He let out a long, shuddering breath. "She took the kids to her mother's," he said. "I haven't seen them since yesterday. We will get them back," I said. "But first you need to come home." I hung up the phone. I went to the front door and unlocked it. I unlocked the deadbolt. I unlocked the chain. Then I went to the stove and put the kettle on. I took out a second mug. I sat down at the kitchen island to wait. I was not angry anymore. I was not grieving. I was ready. The demolition phase was over. It was time to start the reconstruction. The headlights swept across the kitchen cabinets, blinding me for a second before the engine cut out. I heard the heavy thud of a car door, then the hesitation of footsteps on the walkway. I did not get up. I sat at the island, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone lukewarm. The key turned in the lock. It scraped, fumbled, then clicked. Douglas stepped inside. He looked like a man whose house had burned down while he was sleeping inside it. His shirt was wrinkled, the collar standing up on one side. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, sinking into a face gray with stubble. He stood on the doormat holding a plastic grocery bag that looked like it contained everything he currently owned. He looked at me. He looked at the empty chair next to me. "Dad," he croaked. "Sit down, Douglas." He walked over, his movements stiff like an old man. He pulled out the stool and collapsed onto it. He put the plastic bag on the counter. It slid over, hitting the fruit bowl. I poured him a cup of coffee. I pushed it toward him. "I'm sorry," he whispered. He did not look at the coffee. He looked at his hands. "I'm so sorry." "Drink," I said. He lifted the mug. His hands were shaking so bad, the liquid sloshed over the rim, staining his knuckles brown. He took a sip, then another. The warmth seemed to shock him back into his body. "She took everything, Dad," he said, his voice gaining a little strength. "The joint account, the savings. She even drained the college fund for the twins. She moved it all to an account I cannot touch. She is a professional," I said. "She knows how to move money, and she knows you do not." He flinched. "I deserve that." "No," I said. "You deserved a wife who loved you, not a predator who saw you as a soft target." I looked at him. Really looked at him. The last time we sat here, he had been trying to convince me I was crazy. Now he just looked lost. "Why did you do it, Douglas?" I asked. "Not the money. Why did you let her lock me in that basement?" He closed his eyes. Tears squeezed out, tracking through the stubble on his cheeks. "I was afraid," he said. "Afraid of what?" "That I would say." Afraid she would leave, he confessed, the words rushing out. She was always threatening it. Every time I stood up to her, every time I questioned her spending, she would get cold. She would say I was just like you, stubborn, outdated. She said if I didn't get on board with the plan, she would take the kids and go to California. I thought if I gave her what she wanted, she would finally be happy. I shook my head. "You cannot fill a bucket that has a hole in the bottom, son." I reached across the counter and put my hand on his arm. It felt thin under the fabric of his shirt. "Margaret knew," I said. Douglas looked up. "What, your mother? She knew. That is why she made the trust." "She was not trying to cut you out, Douglas. She was trying to build a wall around the money so Pamela could not get to it. She was trying to protect you from your own wife." Douglas stared at me. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "She loved you," I said. "She loved you enough to make sure that when this day came, and she knew it would come, you would not be destitute, and the twins would have a future." He put his head down on the cool granite of the counter and wept. It was not the quiet, polite crying of a funeral. It was the ugly, heaving sobs of a man realizing he had spent 6 years building a life on a sinkhole. I let him cry. I drank my coffee and looked out the dark window. When he finally quieted, wiping his face with his sleeve, I spoke. We have a hearing in 5 days, I said. Emergency custody. Evelyn filed the petition this afternoon. He looked at me, hope warring with terror in his eyes. You are going to walk into that courtroom, I said, and you are going to tell the truth. Not for me, not for the money, for Lily and Noah. I will, he whispered. I swear, Dad, I will. The Franklin County Court of Common Pleas smelled of floor wax and anxiety. The hallway was lined with people sitting on wooden benches, clutching paperwork, staring at their phones or the floor. Nobody looked happy. This was domestic relations court. Nobody came here because they were having a good day. We sat on the left side. Me, Douglas, Evelyn. On the right side sat Pamela. She looked perfect. She wore a cream-colored suit that screamed innocent victim. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant bun. She sat next to a man in a $3,000 suit, a shark named Levinson, whom I had seen on billboards down by the highway. She did not look at us. She stared straight ahead at the judge's empty bench, her chin high. All rise, the bailiff droned. Judge Holloway swept in. She was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose and an expression that suggested she had heard every lie ever told in the state of Ohio. She sat down and opened the file. We are here for an emergency hearing regarding temporary allocation of parental rights and responsibilities for the minor children, Lily and Noah Callahan, she said. Case number 429. She looked over her glasses. I have reviewed the filings. The petitioner, Mr. Douglas Callahan, alleges financial misconduct and parental alienation. The respondent, Mrs. Pamela Callahan, alleges, she paused, glancing at the paper, emotional instability and undue influence by an abusive grandparent. Levinson stood up, smoothing his jacket. Your Honor, he boomed. His voice was designed to fill a room. My client is a devoted mother and a certified public accountant with an impeccable record. Her husband has abandoned the marital home and is currently residing with his father, a man against whom my client has filed a police report for domestic menacing. We are asking for full temporary custody and a restraining order against the grandfather. Judge Holloway turned her gaze to our table. Ms. Monroe Evelyn stood up. She did not boom. She spoke with the quiet precision of a surgeon. Your Honor, the police report Mr. Levinson refers to was filed as a defensive tactic after Mr. Frank Callahan filed his own report against the respondent for false imprisonment, a report supported by audio evidence. She picked up a flash drive from the table. We are not here to litigate the divorce today, Evelyn continued. We are here to determine the safety of the children. We have submitted into evidence audio recordings that demonstrate the respondent's pattern of predatory behavior, fraud, and willingness to exploit vulnerable family members. She handed the drive to the bailiff. Levinson jumped up. Objection, relevance, and authenticity. We have not verified, overruled, Judge Holloway said. She looked at the bailiff. Play it. The courtroom went quiet. The bailiff plugged the drive into the system, a hiss of static. Then Pamela's voice filled the room, amplified by the ceiling speakers. It was the hospital recording. Don't worry about it, Mom. We will handle it. Dad is going to need care. We will probably sell the place. It is too big for him anyway. Pamela stiffened. Her back went ramrod straight. And the land downtown, Margaret's weak voice asked. Sold. Pamela's voice said, casual and cold. Douglas and I have looked into it. It is prime real estate. Dad will be comfortable. There are nice facilities. I watched the judge. Her face did not change, but her eyes narrowed slightly. The recording ended. Before Levinson could speak, the second one began. The one from the basement. You will sign or you will be here until you die. I don't care. The brutality of it stripped the air from the room. It was not the voice of a devoted mother. It was the voice of a jailer. Pamela's hand went to her throat. She looked at Levinson, panic flickering behind her eyes. Levinson looked down at his notes, suddenly very interested in his pen. The recording stopped. Evelyn remained standing. Your Honor, she said, this recording was made 1 week ago. The respondent locked a 72-year-old man in a basement to extort a power of attorney signature. The petitioner, Mr. Douglas Callahan, was present and can testify to the events. We submit that a person capable of such calculated cruelty is not fit to have sole unsupervised control over 2 5-year-old children. Judge Holloway looked at Pamela. Ms. Whitfield, the judge said, do you have an explanation for these recordings? Pamela stood up. Her legs looked unsteady. Your Honor? She said, her voice trembling. It is taken out of context. I was under extreme stress. His father is difficult. He was refusing to listen to reason. False imprisonment is not a stress response, Ms. Whitfield, the judge said sharply. It is a crime. The judge closed the file. The sound was like a gunshot. This is a temporary hearing, she said. I'm not making a final ruling on the divorce or the asset division today. But regarding the children, the court has heard enough. She picked up her pen. I am granting temporary residential parent status to the father, Mr. Douglas Callahan. The mother, Mrs. Whitfield, shall have supervised visitation only, Tuesdays and Thursdays from 4 to 6 and alternating Saturdays, to be monitored by a court-appointed social worker. Pamela gasped. A strangled sound escaped her throat. Furthermore, the judge continued, ignoring her. I'm granting the motion for grandparent companionship. Mr. Frank Callahan shall have visitation rights on alternating weekends. The court also orders Ms. Whitfield to surrender all passports for the minor children to the clerk of courts by 5 o'clock today. But, Pamela started, one more word. Ms. Whitfield and I will find you in contempt, the judge warned. We will reconvene in 60 days for a status conference. Until then, these orders are law. She banged the gavel. Pamela collapsed into her chair. She looked small. The expensive suit suddenly looked like a costume. She stared at the table, her hands shaking, her entire reality fracturing in real time. She had lost. Not because she wasn't smart, not because she didn't have a plan. She lost because she forgot that other people were real. Levinson was already packing his briefcase. He whispered something to her, patted her shoulder perfunctorily, and walked away. Douglas turned to me. His face was pale, stunned. Dad, he whispered. Did we win? I looked at Pamela sitting alone at the defense table, the ruins of her arrogance scattered around her. I looked at Evelyn, who gave me a sharp, satisfied nod. We did not win, Douglas, I said quietly. We just stopped losing. 2 months later. The morning air was crisp, smelling of wet leaves and coffee. I sat on the back patio, the floral cushion of Margaret's chair comfortable beneath me. The sun was just coming up over the garage roof, turning the frost on the grass into a field of diamonds. I was not alone. Grandpa watched this. Noah ran across the yard, a blur of blue jacket and red sneakers. He threw a tennis ball for Buster, the golden retriever Douglas had adopted from the shelter 3 weeks ago. The dog barked a joyous, uncomplicated sound and scrambled after it. Lily was sitting on the patio pavers near my feet, drawing with sidewalk chalk. She was drawing a house. It was a lopsided purple square with a chimney that defied gravity, but it had a solid foundation. Douglas sat on the bench near the oak tree. He was holding a steaming mug, watching his children. He looked tired. The divorce proceedings were ugly, and Pamela was fighting over every teaspoon and towel, but he looked solid. He had a job again, working project management for a logistics firm. He was living in the guest room for now, saving money, rebuilding his credit score one pay stub at a time. He looked up and caught my eye. He raised his mug in a silent toast. I nodded back. The fear was gone from his eyes. There was sadness there, sure. You do not walk away from a wreck without scars. But the fear was gone, Grandpa Lily asked, looking up from her masterpiece. Why is your house so strong? I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. Because I built it with good bones, Lilybug, I said. She frowned, scrunching her nose. Houses don't have bones, they have bricks. I laughed. Bricks are bones, and mortar is the muscle. She went back to drawing. Daddy says Grandma helped build it too, but she wasn't a bricklayer. I looked at the brick chimney. I looked at the spot where the V-shaped crack hid the empty niche. No, I said softly. She wasn't a bricklayer. She was the architect. What does an architect do? Noah asked, running back with the slobbery ball. An architect sees the future, I said. An architect makes sure the walls are strong enough to hold up the roof when the storm comes. I looked at my son. I looked at my grandchildren. Margaret had seen the storm coming. She had drawn the blueprints for our survival. She had protected us from beyond the grave, not just with money, but with the truth. I took a sip of my coffee. It was hot and strong. The sun cleared the roofline, flooding the yard with light. The shadows retreated. The house stood firm, its red bricks glowing in the dawn. It had weathered the storm. It had held the line, and so had I. I stood up, my knees popping, and walked out into the grass. Who wants to learn how to mix cement? I asked. Me, they shouted in unison. I smiled. Margaret, I thought. We made it. I walked toward them, ready to start building again. The bag of Portland cement weighed 94 pounds. Douglas gripped the corners, his knuckles turning white, and heaved. Thud. Dust puffed out, coating his black dress shoes, the only shoes he owned, in a layer of gray powder. He stumbled, his knees buckling, but he didn't drop it. He wrestled the bag onto the mixing trough and stood up, gasping for air. I leaned against the garage door frame, sipping my coffee. I didn't offer to help. You are using your back, Douglas, I said. You need to use your legs. He wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of mud. I'm trying, Dad. I know. But gravity does not care about effort. It cares about leverage. We were building a retaining wall for the flower bed Margaret had always wanted but never got. It was a small job, a weekend job for me. But for Douglas, it was Everest. He had spent 20 years moving spreadsheets and pacifying a tyrant. He had forgotten how to interact with the physical world. He sliced the bag open with a trowel. He picked up the hose. Stop, I said. He froze water dripping onto his shoes. Look at the mix, I said, pointing. You do not just drown it. You add water until it looks like oatmeal. Too wet and it cracks when it cures. Too dry and it won't bond. It has to be balanced. Douglas looked at the gray powder. Like a marriage, he muttered. I took a step closer. The humor was dark, but it was there. That was new. Pamela was all water, son, I said. She drowned you. You never had a chance to set. He turned the hose on a gentle spray this time. He worked the hoe back and forth, the muscles in his forearms straining. It was clumsy. It was inefficient. But he was doing it. I watched him. For years, I had watched him shrink. I had watched him fold himself into smaller and smaller boxes to fit Pamela's expectations. Now, watching him sweat over a trough of mud, I saw him expanding. He wasn't a master mason. He never would be. But he was standing up. Is this right? He asked, looking at the slurry. I peered into the trough. It was a little lumpy, but it would hold. It will do, I said. Now grab a brick. Let us see if you can lay a straight line. He picked up the red clay brick. He weighed it in his hand, testing its substance. It is heavier than I remember, he said. Real things usually are, I said. When the final brick is laid and the mortar cures, a house is just a structure. It is wood, glass, and stone standing against the elements. But a home is built from something far more fragile and far more volatile. It is built from the decisions we make in the dark, the secrets we keep to protect the ones we love, and the painful, necessary boundaries we draw when that love is weaponized against us. As you walk away from Frank Callahan's story, you might be tempted to categorize it simply as a victory of good over evil. It feels satisfying to watch Pamela with her sharp suits and sharper tongue crumble under the weight of her own arrogance. It feels righteous to see Frank, the quiet, blue-collar craftsman, outmaneuver a woman who thought his calloused hands meant he had a slow mind. But if you strip away the drama of the locked basement and the secret recordings, you are left with a much more uncomfortable truth about family dynamics, financial safety, and the true cost of passivity. This story wasn't just about a hero and a villain. It was a mirror held up to the silent fractures that exist in almost every family, fractures that we often ignore until the roof caves in. You need to look closely at the character of Douglas. It is easy to hate Pamela. She is the architect of malice. She is the one who shoved an old man down the stairs and plotted to steal an inheritance. Her evil is loud, active, and undeniable. But Douglas represents a danger that is far more common and in some ways far more insidious, the danger of the enabler. You probably know Douglas. Maybe you have one in your own family. He is the peacemaker who keeps the peace by sacrificing the innocent. He is the man who sees the wrongdoing, who feels the knot of guilt in his stomach, but who chooses the path of least resistance because he is terrified of conflict. Douglas stood in that kitchen. He heard the threats. He saw his father, the man who raised him, who carried him on his shoulders, get pushed into the darkness, and he did nothing. The lesson here is harsh but necessary. Weakness is not a neutral act. We often confuse being nice or quiet with being innocent. We tell ourselves, he didn't do the bad thing, he just didn't stop it. But in the eyes of the law, and certainly in the eyes of morality, silence is complicity. When you allow a predator to operate under your roof because you are too afraid to speak up, you are not a bystander. You are the gateway. You are the unlocked door. The tragedy of Douglas is that he lost everything, his marriage, his money, and nearly his father, not because he was malicious, but because he refused to have a backbone. You have to ask yourself, is there a situation in your life right now where you are keeping the peace at the expense of the truth? Are you letting someone you love be mistreated because you are afraid of rocking the boat? Because as Frank learned, a boat that is being steered into an iceberg needs to be rocked. It needs to be capsized, if that is what it takes to save the passengers. Then there is the lesson of Pamela, and it is a lesson about the arrogance of intellect. Pamela made a fatal calculation that destroyed her life. She assumed that because she had the degrees, the corporate title, and the vocabulary of the business world, she was inherently smarter than a man who worked with his hands. She looked at Frank and saw a relic. She saw a dusty old bricklayer who didn't understand how the modern world worked. This is a trap that so many people fall into. We mistake kindness for stupidity. We mistake silence for ignorance. We assume that because someone is old or quiet or doesn't use the latest technology, they are helpless. Pamela failed to realize that wisdom, true deep survivalist wisdom, does not come from a textbook. It comes from a lifetime of building things that last. Frank knew how to wait. He knew how to build a foundation. He knew that you don't strike until the mortar is set. Never underestimate the people in your life who built the world you are walking on. They may not speak your language, but they know how the structure holds together, and more importantly, they know how to take it apart. But the most critical lesson, the one that could actually save your family from ruin, comes from the empty chair at the table. It comes from Margaret. Margaret is the ghost in this story, but she is also its hero. She represents the ultimate act of love preparation. We like to think of love as a feeling. We think of it as hugs or kind words or Sunday dinners. But Margaret understood that in the real world, love is a legal document. Love is an irrevocable trust. Think about the timeline. Margaret didn't wait until she was on her deathbed to protect her family. She did it 7 years ago. She saw the storm clouds gathering on the horizon, the greed in Pamela's eyes, the weakness in Douglas's spirit, and she built a shelter. She didn't utilize a simple will, which can be contested, dragged through probate, and picked apart by vultures. She used a trust. This is the educational takeaway you need to write down. A will is a set of instructions you leave for the judge. A trust is a transfer of power you execute while you are alive. By moving her assets into an irrevocable trust, Margaret changed the ownership of the property. When Pamela tried to attack Frank's assets, she hit a brick wall because Frank didn't own them anymore. You cannot steal from a man what he does not possess. Margaret's brilliance wasn't just financial, it was emotional. By locking the money away, she removed the poison from the well. She ensured that if Douglas came back, he would come back for his father, not for the inheritance. She ensured that her grandchildren would have a future that no amount of bad parenting could erase. So here's the question you need to grapple with. If you were gone tomorrow, what would happen to the people you love? Have you built a wall to protect them, or have you just left them a pile of bricks and hoped they could figure it out? Are you relying on the goodwill of family members, or have you codified your wishes into law? Because as we saw with Douglas and Pamela, grief does strange things to people, and money does even stranger things. The time to build the ark is before the rain starts, not when the water is already at your neck. Furthermore, we must talk about the transformation of Frank. At the beginning of this journey, Frank was a man waiting to die. He resigned. He was living in a museum of his own, preserving the past, but disengaged from the present. He allowed Pamela to chip away at his dignity because he thought he had no fight left. His journey teaches us that agency is something you have to seize. No one is going to give it to you. When he was locked in that basement, Frank had a choice. He could have curled up on the floor and waited for rescue. He could have banged on the door and begged. Instead, he remembered who he was. He remembered that he was a craftsman. He remembered that locks are just mechanical puzzles and that bullies are just weak people pretending to be strong. Frank's escape wasn't just physical, it was psychological. He stopped being a victim the moment he picked up those lockpicks. And when he walked into that lawyer's office, he wasn't looking for revenge, he was looking for justice. There is a profound difference. Revenge is about making the other person suffer because you are in pain. Justice is about restoring balance. Justice is about ensuring that the innocent are protected and the guilty are stripped of their power to harm. Frank didn't destroy Pamela because he hated her. He dismantled her because she was a threat to the innocent things in his garden, his grandchildren. He learned that you cannot be a passive observer in your own life. You have to be the architect. You have to draw the line. You have to say, this far and no further. And finally, we have to talk about the ending. It wasn't a fairy tale, and that is why it matters. In a lesser story, Douglas would have apologized and everything would have gone back to normal instantly. They would have hugged and the trauma would have evaporated. But that is not how life works. Douglas broke something fundamental. He broke the trust of a father. That kind of damage leaves a scar. The beauty of the ending lies in its realism. Frank forgave Douglas, yes. He let him back into the house. He poured him a cup of coffee. But he didn't pretend the past hadn't happened. He didn't fix Douglas's problems for him. He handed him a trowel and told him to get to work. This is the ultimate form of parenting. It is easy to shield our children from the consequences of their actions. It is easy to bail them out to write the check to smooth the road. But Frank realized that by doing that, he had contributed to Douglas's weakness. He had been the mortar holding Douglas together for too long. By stepping back, by letting Douglas hit rock bottom in that Motel 6 parking lot, Frank allowed his son to finally find his own footing. Reconciliation is hard work. It is messy. It involves sitting in a kitchen with a man who betrayed you and choosing to love him anyway, not because he deserves it, but because he is yours. It involves understanding that people can be good and weak at the same time. It involves building a new relationship on the rubble of the old one, brick by imperfect brick. So look at your own life. Look at the relationships that are crumbling. Are you trying to hold them together with silence and compliance like Douglas? Or are you willing to do the hard, dusty work of setting boundaries like Frank? Are you preparing for the future like Margaret, or are you assuming everything will work out like the old Frank? This story is a call to action. It is a reminder that your legacy isn't just the money you leave behind. It is the values you instill. It is the strength you demonstrate when the lights go out. It is the refusal to be a victim in your own home. You have the tools. You have the blueprint. The question is, are you willing to pick up the trowel and build something that can weather the storm? Because the storm is coming. It always is. And when it hits, the only thing that matters is the quality of the foundation you laid when the sun was shining. Take a moment tonight. Look at your walls. Look at your paperwork. Look at the people sitting across from you at the dinner table. And ask yourself, if the lock clicks shut on me tomorrow, would I be ready? That is the Mason's inheritance. It isn't gold. It isn't the land. It is the unshakable knowledge that you built a life strong enough to protect the people you love even from themselves.